Well, I'm going to switch gears for the moment, and I won't be talking very much about rivers or floodplains. What I will be doing is talking about some of the potential implications of some of the proposals that have been suggested for the broader landscape. And to do that, I'll try to use some of the information that we've been collecting over the last 20-odd years from the broader landscape, from spinifex landscapes in particular, to suggest what we might expect if some of the proposals go ahead. So for most of what I'll be talking about, it'll be the long-term dynamics of mammals in sand dune habitats, and because it is a long-term study, it's involved a number of people. My colleague Glenda Wardle is at the back at the moment. It involves a number of other people from the Desert Ecology Research Group. So, as we've seen, obviously, over the last couple of days, rainfalls and floods are key drivers in this region. They generate these amazing booms and then busts as the resource productivity collapses. The booms themselves are driven by increases in the rates of reproduction, survival, immigration very often into the area, and then the busts tend to collapse as resources begin to diminish. And in the case of small mammals, as I'll show in a moment, there are some other factors that go on as well, particularly the influxes of invasive predators. And I'll be talking about that as a fairly key driver of the collapse part of the cycle. I'll be using small mammals primarily as examples. We've got a lot of information on lizards and frogs and other taxa as well, and vegetation, but I'll talk about small mammals primarily and the implications of what we've found for some of the potential development proposals. So the study region is the northeastern part of the Simpson Desert in the northern part of the Lake Eyre Basin. It's an area that's dominated by sand dunes, long red sand dunes. They're dominated by spinifex in the swales. The spinifex runs up the sides of these sand dunes towards the top, and then shrubs and annual herbs and grasses take over after rainfall. The rainfall itself is pretty low in this part of the desert, around 150 to 200 mils per year, if you can speak about averages, and probably we shouldn't. Temperatures are quite extreme. We've recorded, when we've been out there, temperatures as low as -7 to over 50 degrees. And as you might expect with this sort of boom and bust cycling, there is a fairly important fire signature. On average, wildfires come through about every 25 years. The main sites are spread over these properties here in the northeastern part of the desert. I'll be talking primarily about sites in this area down here on Ethabooka Station in far western Queensland. There are 12 main sites. The different coloured dots there represent up until last year they'd all been part of the one project. More recently we've joined the long-term ecological research network and gathering data longer term on the sites marked by the L-turn symbol, and the rest of the sites are for various projects. Long-term monitoring covers a fairly large area. We try to get to the region from 2 to 6 times a year. Usually we make it 3 or 4 times. It depends very much on how much flooding and on-site rainfall there has been, and then we sample the small vertebrates, the inverts, vegetation. We've got an automatic weather station at each of the 12 main sites. Over the time we've been getting out there, we've seen a number of quite dramatic changes. The 2 shots on the left represent the desert in 1990, in March 1990, at towards the end of a fairly long drought. For those of you who know Ethabooka Homestead, this was Ethabooka at that time. Not much infrastructure and certainly not much vegetation around it. Last year it looked like this. That's Ethabooka there. You can probably get an indication from the windmill at the back, which is the same one over here. But in that time there's been very large growth of ground level vegetation and trees as well. And the same too, 1990, 2012 on one of the dunes. So big changes over this period. To try to work out what the small vertebrates are doing, we put our pitfall traps at each of the sites. There are a number of grids from 2 to 5 trapping grids, each comprising 36 traps. The pitfall traps shown here, with a drift fence running across the top to try to intercept and guide the animals into the traps. And we sample these on a regular basis each time. The hope is that we'll catch any of these engaging sorts of creatures, geckos and dragons, and a range of small mammals. I'll be talking mostly about the hopping mouse here, the sandy inland mouse, two of the most common species of native rodent. This animal here, it's a medium-sized carnivorous marsupial, the mulgara, and this small animal here, an insectivorous dunnart. So these are some of our main species. Well, boom and bust dynamics, this is what they look like as far as the small mammals are concerned. This is the trace for two species, the sandy inland mouse and the spinifex hopping mouse. The capture rate, which is roughly equivalent to the numbers in the population, is shown on the left here, and this is the time signature from 1990 through to the end of last year. And as you can see, for both species, there are periods when the numbers increase. Back here in 91, 92, around 2001, and then more recently 2007, and over the last 2 or 3 years. The traces, the eruptions, tend to be synchronous for the rodents, and if you run your eye down you can see that the spinifex hopping mouse is behaving in pretty much the same way. Differences in the magnitudes of the peaks, but nonetheless the peaks do tend to coincide in time. Well, as you might expect, rainfall is a key driver of these dynamics, and in this slide and in the next several, what I'll be showing is the long-term rainfall trace. This is the rainfall over the period, the annual rainfall from 1990 through to the present, and it's shown here with, again, an average, this line here. An average is probably not good, but for illustrative purposes, it does suggest here that there were some big rainfall events in the early 90s, here in 2000, 2001, and then more recently, 2007, and then over the last 2 or 3 summers. If you line up the big rainfall events with the capture rate of the mouse in the bottom, the sandy inland mouse, all you've got to do is shift the capture rate figures in the bottom by around 6 months, and you get a pretty good correlation. If you do a formal correlation, you find that there is a very good match between rainfall and 6 months later, a dramatic increase in the numbers of the sandy inland mouse. Not surprisingly, the rain generates these huge bursts of primary productivity. Spinifex in particular flowers and sets seed, dumps a huge amount of food on the ground for these animals, which are then able to breed successfully, survival increases. Animals will sometimes move into the area too, and the numbers increase. Very similar thing with the spinifex hopping mouse. As we saw, the numbers tend to track the rainfall events very well. A 6-month lag tends to give you the best correlation, which is the time really taken for the animals to get to access the resources to breed and for survival increases to show up. Similar sorts of patterns for the mulgara, but the time lag here is a little bit longer. The reason here is that although the rain is the stimulatory driver for the mulgaras rely on the rodents being there for their food. So once the rodents have increased in numbers after 6 months post-rain, the mulgaras are then able to turn the rodents into their own babies, and their numbers increase at around 10 months to a year after big rains have fallen. A little bit of a messier trace because we're not looking at a direct rainfall then vegetation driver, but rather a rainfall, rodent, and then mulgara capitalising in a secondary way on the rodents. This 10-month lag. So this is all reasonably what we might expect. One last example for a mammal, this is for the small insect-eating dunnart. These don't behave in the same way. Rainfall seems to really, give the pun, put a dampener on their numbers. They don't like to get their feet wet, and after big rainfall events, their numbers fall. So this is little bit contrary to the popular wisdom of what we might expect with the rodents and the mulgara, and pretty much most other arid-dwelling animals. Dunnuts show negative effects of big rainfalls. One of the reasons probably is that they don't build their own burrows. The animals are uniquely dependent, particularly for desert animals, they're uniquely dependent on the burrows of other species. They depend on having dragons, or rodents, or even spiders and scorpions in the system, so that they can usurp their burrows. And because the burrows of these animals tend to be more in the lower lying parts of the dune fields, when you get heavy rains, these are the areas that fill up, and the animals either drown in situ or get flushed from the burrows and then have nowhere to go. So there's a negative correlation over the long term between rainfall and this particular species. One last example. I won't say very much more about lizards, but we've got good evidence that they do show similar trends, often messier trends. The reptiles seem better able to cope with the periods of boom and certainly the bust periods that follow. But nonetheless, there seems to be a tendency for the capture rates of many species to increase after big rainfall events, and probably for exactly the same reasons. They're benefiting from the flush of productivity. In the case of the lizards, almost certainly from the flush of secondary productivity from the insects, which form the major part of their diet. So this is the sampling of some of the native species that occur, but there are other species in the system that respond as well. And two of the most important, I think from the point of view of these small native vertebrates, are these two, the feral cat and the red fox. And I'd suspect that anybody in the local area here would have seen large numbers of feral cats over the last 2 or 3 years following the eruptions of rodents driven by the big rains. It certainly occurs further west in the sand dune country. The traces here represent standardized numbers of foxes and cats seen on spotlight transects in the sand dune environment. As you can see, there are big fluctuations, particularly big eruptions of fox and cat activity here. They fell during this period, erupted again after the rains in 2000, slowed down a bit during the mid 2000s, and have erupted again more recently. If we overlay the trace for the two predators, the fox and the cat, on the trace for the sandy inland mouse, you can see that they're a little bit offset. So that when you get eruptions of the sandy inland mouse, you tend to get an eruption of the foxes and the cats a little later. And this is because foxes and cats tend to have a longer lead time before they can achieve bigger numbers and more activity. They have to rely upon the booms in small mammal numbers to generate more kittens, more cubs, and for these then to be turning up in the spotlighting record. So there's an offset. The consequence is that you tend to get very high activity of the two predators at times when the small mammals are either declining or very low. So again, a peak here, and if you run your eye down, peak activity of the predators after the small mammals have already done their thing. One other thing to note about the small mammals is that the populations do reach very low levels. I should have mentioned this earlier, that particularly for the hopping mouse, you can go for 5 or 6 years without seeing a single hopping mouse over 7,000 or 8,000 square kilometres of desert. And you think, to all intents and purposes, they've gone. They do come back, and an interesting question is where they go in the meantime, which I'll come to in a moment. So for the moment, rainfall clearly drives big booms of the small mammals. In turn, this allows for eruptions in the numbers of introduced predators. Because of this, we've looked at the diets of the predators and tried to look to see what impacts the predators might be having. So this is just a summary of the diets of foxes and cats over 4 periods of the boom and bust phase of the small mammal cycles. Firstly, during the bust phase, these figures here represent the percentage frequency of small mammals in the diets of either foxes or cats. They tend to be present during the bust periods, even though we're not able to find them ourselves very readily. As you come down through the increase, particularly to the peak and then decline phases of the cycles, virtually every fox and cat, either stomach that you look at or scat that you look at, contains small mammal. And it does suggest that during the peak, and particularly the decline phases, there are really crunch times for the small mammals from the point of view of these invasive predators. If we put all this together, there's a patterning that seems to go something like this. So these are actual data from the sandy inland mouse, again, capture rates along the bottom. Big rains tend to drive increases in their numbers. Within 6 months of a big summer rain, you'll see an eruption in sandy inland mouse numbers. After that, you'll get an increase in the predator numbers, and as the numbers of the native animals are coming down and the invasive predators are coming up, there's a period of intense per capita predation. Not only are the prey coming down, the predators going up, the predators appear to be actively seeking them, such that virtually every predator scat that you find contains small mammals. So these periods, marked by the black arrows, appear to be the real crunch periods for the small mammals in this system. And it's probably one of the reasons why the numbers go so low during the periods between the big rainfall events. Well, thanks, Bob. What are the implications that we might be able to draw from this? We've been talking about various kinds of development possibilities for the Lake Eyre Basin. One of these is for increased irrigation, whether small scale or larger. One of the possibilities of having irrigated lands throughout a bigger part of the landscape, potentially, is that the boom periods will be more fixed in time. So here, where the effects of the rainfall, the flood events begin to diminish, irrigation effects may have the effect of prompting these large increases in numbers to stay with us for longer periods. Certainly in the case of Southeast Asian agriculture, where irrigation has taken place, rodents are a huge problem year-round. They never used to be. In the case of the other kind of proposal, mining effects, where this is coal seam gas, which may have an effect on small refugia through the landscape, or more direct effects through surface removal of vegetation that the animals retreat back to during dry periods. These may have the effect of prolonging or enhancing even further these periods when the numbers are already very low and perhaps at risk from stochastic extinction events. So it's fair to say that we don't have good data on this, and these are things that we think could possibly happen. But just to summarise, it's possible that if irrigation did become broader scale, these boom events could become more fixed across the broader landscape, bringing with them larger numbers or more sustained populations of species that are currently there, such as the long-haired or plague rat, house mice that do very well in the southern irrigation areas. It may well maintain bigger populations of invasive predators, such as the red fox and feral cat, which can have, as we've seen, quite devastating effects on native species. It may have the effect of allowing the arrival and sustaining populations of other species, such as feral pigs, that wouldn't really be welcome, and drawing lessons from other parts of the world where irrigation has taken place for long periods. Waterborne diseases, particularly parasites, mosquito-borne diseases, could be with us as well. And mining also could have the effect of impacts on drought season refugia. So these are reasonably speculative, but nonetheless possibilities from the biology that we know from these various species. So just to conclude then, the boom and bust cycling is obviously a key feature of the Lake Eyre Basin. There are possibilities for these new developments to come on board, and although they're likely to be more obvious or most conspicuous in the first instance for the rivers and the river floodplains, riparian areas in general, especially the downstream effects, there may be broader implications across the landscape, beyond the rivers and the floodplains themselves. We don't have great information on this, and it perhaps suggests that until we do get better at predicting this, that we take a more precautionary approach before going fully ahead and getting some potentially very undesirable effects. So, thank you very much.